Arthur Pendelton stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, nursing a glass of 20-year-old Macallan. 70 floors below, the city of Seattle was a sprawling grid of glittering arteries, a kingdom of glass and steel over which he reigned. At 32, Arthur was the sole founder and CEO of Pendelton Enterprises, a tech logistics empire that had revolutionized global shipping. His net worth was a number so large it felt abstract, even to him. Yet, as he looked out over the city, a profound exhaustion weighed on his shoulders. It wasn't the work that drained him, it was the people. For the past 5 years, Arthur had been surrounded by a suffocating ecosystem of sycophants, yes-men, and social climbers. Every conversation was a calculated transaction. Every smile was an investment. And the women, oh, the women. The society galas and charity balls were little more than hunting grounds where heiresses and ambitious socialites circled him like well-dressed sharks, their eyes tracking the zeros in his bank account rather than the man standing in front of them. He was tired of being a walking wallet. He wanted to know how his company truly operated when the CEO wasn't looking, and more importantly, he wanted to see how people behaved when they thought they had nothing to gain. That was the genesis of Artie. With the help of his fiercely loyal chief security officer, the only person privy to the plan, Arthur had fabricated a ghost employee. Artie Vance. Age, 32. Occupation, night shift janitorial staff, level 4. The transformation was surprisingly simple, yet staggeringly effective. Arthur traded his custom-tailored Tom Ford suits for a stiff, navy blue polycotton jumpsuit. He swapped his Rolex for a scuffed Casio digital watch. He stopped styling his hair, letting it fall in a slightly messy, unruly wave over his forehead, and grew a dusting of rough stubble. But the most significant change was the invisibility cloak that the uniform provided. When Arthur walked onto the 42nd floor, the heart of the marketing division, pushing a yellow-wheeled bucket and holding a mop, it was as if he had ceased to exist. For 3 weeks, Arthur observed his empire from the bottom up. He learned that the sleek, modern glass desks of his executives were often covered in crumbs and spilled coffee. He learned which managers stayed late to actually work, and which ones stayed late just to browse the internet so their badge swipes would look impressive to HR. He listened to the gossip, the complaints, and the genuine struggles of his employees. It was the most liberating experience of his life. Nobody sucked up to the janitor. Nobody laughed at his bad jokes. He was finally just a man. And then, he met Isabella. The marketing floor. It was 7:30 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday. The 42nd floor was mostly deserted, save for a few junior executives grinding out a last-minute quarterly presentation. Arthur was methodically emptying the recycling bins, the rhythmic thump of the plastic containers a soothing soundtrack to his thoughts. As he approached the southeast corner of the open-plan office, he heard a voice. It was a melodic, sultry voice, currently laced with a heavy dose of irritation. "I am telling you, Chloe, if he thinks a dinner at a mid-tier steakhouse and a bouquet of cheap bodega roses is going to win me over, he is absolutely delusional." Arthur paused, his hand hovering over a trash can. He peered through the frosted glass partition. There sat Isabella Rossi. Even in the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the corporate office, she was breathtakingly beautiful. She had cascading dark hair that looked like spun silk, piercing green eyes, and a bone structure that could cut glass. She was a junior marketing executive, but she carried herself like she was the chairwoman of the board. Currently, she was leaning back in her ergonomic chair, tapping a perfectly manicured nail against her phone screen, talking to a colleague in the next cubicle. "Isabella, he's a senior financial analyst," her co-worker, Chloe, replied softly, sounding exhausted. "He makes $250,000 a year. He's a great catch." Isabella let out a sharp, aristocratic laugh that echoed in the empty office. $250,000? Chloe, please. In this economy? That barely covers rent in a decent zip code and a baseline wardrobe. I am not spending my 20s slumming it with a man who has to look at price tags. I have a 5-year plan, and it does not involve clipping coupons or flying commercial. Arthur leaned closer, genuinely fascinated. He had met hundreds of gold diggers in his life, but they usually had the decency to cloak their greed in feigned interest or fake philanthropy. Isabella was brutally, unapologetically mercenary. I need a C-suite executive, minimum, Isabella continued, spinning a gold Cartier love bracelet around her wrist, likely a gift from a previous, now discarded suitor. Preferably someone with equity. Did you see the spread in Forbes last month? The CEO of this very company, Arthur Pendelton. He's only 32. Unmarried. Net worth in the billions. That, Chloe, is the target. I just need to figure out how to get onto the VIP list for the Diamond Gala next month. Arthur suppressed a smirk. The target? He looked down at his stained blue uniform and his calloused hands. It was almost too poetic. You're crazy, Izzy, Chloe sighed, packing up her laptop. Pendleton doesn't even talk to his own VPs, let alone junior marketing staff. He's basically a ghost. Anyway, I'm going home. Don't stay too late plotting your billionaire heist. Good night, darling. I'll be right behind you. I just need to finish this deck, Isabella murmured, already turning her attention back to her dual monitors. The collision. Chloe departed, leaving Isabella alone in her section. Arthur realized he had been standing perfectly still for 5 minutes. He shook his head, gripping the handle of his mop. It was time to get back to work. He wheeled his yellow bucket down the aisle, the squeaky left wheel echoing loudly. He approached Isabella's desk. She didn't look up. To her, the sound of the janitor was just white noise, no different from the hum of the air conditioning. Arthur dipped his mop into the soapy water, wrung it out, and began to clean the scuff marks on the linoleum walkway next to her expensive Persian rug, a personal touch she had brought from home to elevate her workspace. As he worked, he couldn't help but steal glances at her. She was fiercely focused, her eyes darting across spreadsheets, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was undoubtedly smart and capable, which somehow made her superficiality even more tragic to him. He took a step backward, pulling the bucket with him. He didn't notice the stray charging cable snaking across the floor from Isabella's desk. Thwack! The squeaky wheel caught the thick cable. Arthur tugged, the bucket lurched dangerously, and a wave of soapy, gray water sloshed over the rim. It hit the floor with a wet smack, sending a fan of dirty droplets directly onto the edge of Isabella's pristine, cream-colored Persian rug, stopping mere millimeters from a pair of black suede Manolo Blahnik pumps resting under her desk. Isabella gasped, a sharp, dramatic intake of air. She pushed her chair back violently, the wheels grinding against the plastic mat. "Are you blind?" she shrieked, her voice shattering the quiet of the office. Arthur immediately grabbed a handful of microfiber rags from his cart. "I am so sorry, miss. The cable was in the walkway, and the wheel caught. I don't care about your excuses." Isabella snapped, jumping to her feet. She pointed a trembling finger at the damp spot on the edge of her rug. "Do you have any idea how much this rug costs? It is hand-woven silk from Istanbul. It probably costs more than you make in 6 months, you idiot." Arthur knelt down, quickly and efficiently blotting the water before it could soak in. He kept his head down, partially to play the role of the subservient cleaner, and partially to hide the flash of anger in his eyes. He was used to being treated with immense deference. Being yelled at like a disobedient dog was a jarring new sensation. "It's just water, miss," Arthur said, his voice remarkably calm, deliberately modulating his deep baritone to sound meeker. "I've got it all soaked up. There won't be a stain." "That is not the point." Isabella glared down at him, her beautiful face contorted with disgust. She looked at him as if he were a cockroach that had scurried across her desk. She took in his cheap blue uniform, his messy hair, his scuffed work boots. "The point is your sheer incompetence," she hissed, crossing her arms over her designer silk blouse. "This is a corporate headquarters, not a public high school. You people are supposed to be invisible. You're supposed to clean up after us, not create messes. Look at you, you almost ruined my Manolos. If a single drop of dirty mop water had touched this suede, I would have had you fired before you could even clock out." Arthur stood up slowly. He was 6'2", and even in a shapeless jumpsuit, he cut an imposing figure. For a fraction of a second, the billionaire CEO flashed through the janitor's facade. He locked eyes with Isabella. His gaze was steady, cool, and analytical. Isabella faltered for a microsecond. She had expected the cleaner to cower, to apologize profusely, to scurry away. Instead, the man looking back at her had eyes that were intelligent, piercing, and entirely unafraid. It unsettled her, but only fueled her arrogance further. "What are you looking at?" she demanded, raising her chin haughtily. "Finish cleaning up your mess and get out of my section. And if you ever come near my desk with that filthy bucket again, I will personally ensure HR throws you out on the street." Arthur held her gaze for one beat longer, committing every detail of her sneer to memory. "Understood," Arthur said quietly. "It won't happen again." He turned, grabbed his mop, and smoothly wheeled his cart down the aisle, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor. As he walked toward the service elevator, Arthur felt a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't just anger, it was an electric current of anticipation. Isabella Rossi was everything he despised about the world he lived in. She was greedy, cruel to those she deemed beneath her, and utterly obsessed with wealth and status. But she was also his employee. And she was determined to hunt down Arthur Pendelton. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Arthur's face as he punched the button for the basement level. Isabella wanted a billionaire? She wanted the CEO. She was going to get him. But first, he was going to see exactly how far she would go, and how terribly she would treat a man who had nothing but a mop and a name tag. The game had officially begun. The apex was what the employees of Pendelton Enterprises called the 15th floor corporate cafeteria, and the name was entirely appropriate. It wasn't a mere dining hall, it was a sprawling, multi-million-dollar culinary pavilion encased in floor-to-ceiling glass that offered panoramic views of the Puget Sound. Inside, the air hummed with the aggressive, caffeinated energy of 1,000 ambitious professionals. There were artisanal sushi bars, a wood-fired pizza oven, and a barista station that exclusively served single-origin beans. It was also the ultimate stage for the company's brutal social hierarchy. The executives and senior vice presidents claimed the plush, soundproofed booths along the west wall. The mid-level managers clustered around the large oak tables in the center, aggressively networking over quinoa bowls. And then there was Isabella Rossi, who, despite being a junior marketing executive, had managed to lay claim to a prime corner table near the windows. She held court there every day at 12:30 p.m. sharp, treating the cafeteria like her own personal VIP lounge. Today, Isabella was radiating an almost dangerous level of manic energy. She wore a tailored, emerald green blazer draped effortlessly over her shoulders and was picking at a seared ahi tuna salad with absolute disinterest. Her real focus was her phone, and the two colleagues sitting across from her, Chloe, who looked perpetually exhausted by Isabella's orbit, and Trent, a junior account manager who harbored a pathetic, unrequited crush on Isabella and agreed with everything she said. "I'm telling you, it's a disaster," Isabella groaned, tossing her phone onto the table. The screen displayed a digital receipt for a gown that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "The tailor says taking the waist in by 2 inches will compromise the beadwork. If I don't look flawless for the Diamond Gala next week, I might as well not even go. Arthur Pendelton is finally making a public appearance. This is the opportunity of a lifetime, and my dress is being held hostage by an incompetent seamstress. You'll look beautiful in anything, Izzy, Trent offered weakly, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Isabella gave him a pitying smile. Trent, sweetie, beautiful doesn't secure a ring from a billionaire. Unforgettable does. Devastating does. I need to walk down those stairs and make every other woman in the room look like they bought their dresses off the clearance rack. She sighed, taking a delicate sip of her sparkling water. I just hope the venue is secure. After the other night, I'm convinced this company hires its support staff out of a halfway house. What happened the other night? Chloe asked, taking a bite of her sandwich. Oh, just some clumsy, bumbling idiot in a blue jumpsuit, Isabella sneered, her voice carrying over the ambient noise of the cafeteria. The janitor. He almost dumped a bucket of filthy, toxic mop water all over my Manolos. And worse, he just stood there staring at me afterward. Completely brain dead. I swear, they let just anyone into this building nowadays. The approach. 50 feet away, standing near the tray return station, Arthur Pendelton heard every word. He was wearing his standard RD uniform, the stiff, navy blue polycotton jumpsuit with the embroidered name tag, heavy work boots, and a gray undershirt. He held a half-eaten turkey sandwich wrapped in foil. Normally, he ate his lunch in the basement break room, a windowless bunker shared by the maintenance crew, where the conversations revolved around sports and union dues. But today, he had come up to the apex. He had come up specifically for Isabella. Since their encounter 2 nights ago, Arthur hadn't been able to stop thinking about her. Not out of attraction, though she was undeniably stunning, but out of a morbid, sociological fascination. He had spent his entire adult life being insulated by his wealth, shielded from the harsh realities of how cruel people could be when there were no consequences. Isabella was a fascinatingly venomous creature. He wanted to see just how deep her vanity ran. He wanted to test the limits of her superficiality. Arthur took a deep breath, tossed his foil wrapper into the recycling bin, and wiped his hands on his jumpsuit. He squared his shoulders. It was time to run the experiment. As Arthur stepped away from the wall and began walking toward the sea of tables, the reaction was immediate and palpable. The apex was not designed for the blue-collar staff. The unspoken rule was that the maintenance crew ate downstairs. As Arthur navigated the narrow aisles between the tables, the conversations around him suddenly died down. Sharp-suited analysts and perfectly coiffed PR directors paused mid-bite, their eyes tracking the anomalous blue jumpsuit moving through their pristine environment. Arthur ignored the stares. He focused entirely on the emerald green blazer at the corner table. When he reached Isabella's table, he stopped. He stood tall, deliberately invading her peripheral vision. Trent stopped talking mid-sentence. Chloe looked up, her eyes widening in mild panic. Isabella, however, kept her eyes glued to her phone screen. "Excuse me," she said, her tone dripping with icy annoyance, assuming it was a busboy coming to clear her plate. "I'm still eating. Come back in 10 minutes. "I'm not here for your plate, Miss Rossi," Arthur said. His deep, resonant voice caused Isabella to freeze. She slowly raised her head, her manicured fingers gripping the edge of the table. When her emerald eyes locked onto his, a flash of recognition washed over her face, followed instantly by a look of profound disgust. "You," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "The mop boy. What do you want? Didn't I tell you to stay away from my section?" Arthur offered a polite, mild smile, completely unfazed by her hostility. "I apologize for the interruption, Isabella. I know we got off on the wrong foot the other night. I wanted to formally introduce myself. My name is Artie." Isabella stared at him as if he had just spoken to her in a dead language. She looked around the table at Trent and Chloe, silently asking them to bear witness to this absurdity. "Artie," she repeated, tasting the name and finding it repulsive. And what exactly makes you think you have the right to address me by my first name, Artie? I just wanted to make amends, Arthur continued, playing the role of the earnest, slightly naive blue-collar worker to perfection. He intentionally pitched his voice just loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. I was wondering if, perhaps, you might want to grab a cup of coffee with me after your shift today? Just to clear the air. My treat. The humiliation. For a long, agonizing moment, there was total silence at the table. Even the ambient noise of the surrounding cafeteria seemed to drop a few decibels, as the nearby executives leaned in, smelling blood in the water. Then, Isabella started to laugh. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a loud, theatrical, deeply cruel laugh that echoed off the glass walls. She threw her head back, her dark hair cascading over the green blazer, shaking with genuine amusement. Trent, eager to please her, started snickering nervously. A coffee? Isabella gasped, wiping a phantom tear from her eye. She stood up, planting her hands on the table, leaning forward to look Arthur up and down like he was a defective piece of merchandise. You want to take me out for a coffee? Yes, Arthur said simply, his face an unreadable mask. Isabella's amusement instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, surgical cruelty. She raised her voice, ensuring that at least 50 people in the immediate vicinity could hear every word. Let me make something abundantly clear to you, Artie, she said, her voice ringing out like a cracked bell. Look at me. Look at my clothes. Look at the bag sitting on that chair. Now, look at yourself. She gestured dismissively toward his uniform. You are wearing a polyester jumpsuit that smells like industrial bleach. You push a yellow bucket for a living. Your entire monthly salary probably couldn't cover the tax on my shoes. Arthur didn't flinch, though he felt a sharp, unexpected sting in his chest. It wasn't his ego that was bruised, it was his faith in humanity. To see someone tear another human being down with such gleeful malice was sobering. Isabella, there's no need to, Chloe started, looking deeply uncomfortable, but Isabella cut her off with a sharp wave of her hand. No, Chloe, clearly he needs a reality check, Isabella snapped, turning her venom back to Arthur. I don't know what kind of HR diversity initiative made you think we are peers, but we are not. We exist in completely different stratospheres. I don't date men who clip coupons. I don't date men who take the bus. And I certainly don't date the hired help. She took a step closer to him, her voice dropping into a vicious sneer. Let me give you a piece of advice, Artie. Stay in the basement where you belong. Because I only date men who own the building, not the pathetic ones who mop its floors. A collective, quiet gasp rippled through the nearby tables. It was a devastating, flawless execution. Isabella sat back down, flipping her hair over her shoulder, picking up her fork as if she had just swatted a minor fly. Now, get out of my sight before I call security and tell them you're harassing me. Arthur stood there for 2 seconds. He catalogued her smug smile, Trent's sycophantic nodding, and the averted eyes of the executives pretending they hadn't just watched a public execution. I understand, Arthur said, his voice quiet, steady, and devoid of any emotion. Have a good afternoon, Miss Rossi. He turned on his heavy work boots and began the long walk back across the cafeteria. He could feel the hundreds of eyes boring into his back. He could hear the low murmurs and the smothered chuckles. For the first time in his life, Arthur Pendelton, the billionaire king of Seattle, felt what it was like to be completely and utterly powerless. A glimmer of light. Arthur pushed through the heavy glass double doors of the apex and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted elevator lobby. He pressed the down button, leaning his forehead against the cool steel of the door frame. He closed his eyes. Well, he thought. Experiment concluded. Hypothesis confirmed. She is a monster. Excuse me. Arthur flinched, opening his eyes and turning around. Standing a few feet away was a young woman. She was petite, with warm, espresso brown skin and curly hair pulled back into a messy bun. She was wearing a simple, inexpensive floral blouse and a beige cardigan that had clearly seen a few trips through the washing machine. She was holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Arthur recognized her vaguely. She was an administrative assistant from the legal department on the 30th floor. He had emptied her trash can a few times. "Hi," she said softly, her voice carrying a gentle, hesitant cadence. "I'm Maya." "Artie," Arthur replied gruffly, his defenses still up. "Can I help you?" Maya took a tentative step forward and held out one of the paper cups. I was sitting a few tables over. I saw what happened in there. With Isabella." Arthur's jaw tightened. "Did you come out here to laugh, too?" "No." Maya's eyes widened in genuine horror. "God, no. I came out here to make sure you were okay. That was incredibly cruel. Nobody deserves to be spoken to like that. Ever. Regardless of what they do for a living." Arthur stared at her. He looked at the paper cup in her hand, then up at her face. Her eyes were wide, earnest, and filled with an intense, uncomplicated empathy. There was no agenda there. No calculation. Just basic, human decency. "I brought you a coffee," Maya said, offering it again with a small, self-deprecating smile. "It's not the fancy single origin stuff from the barista station. It's just from the drip machine in the legal break room. I put 2 sugars in it. I hope that's okay. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I just wanted you to know that not everyone in this building is like her." Arthur slowly reached out and took the cup. The cardboard was warm against his calloused palms. He looked down at the cheap, white cup, and suddenly, the suffocating weight that had been pressing on his chest for the last 5 years lifted just a fraction of an inch. "Thank you, Maya," Arthur said, and for the first time in weeks, his smile was entirely genuine. "2 sugars is exactly how I like it." The company-wide email arrived at precisely 9 a.m. on a Thursday, detonating across the 42nd floor like a perfectly manicured social grenade. Subject: the 10th Annual Pendelton Enterprises Diamond Gala. Within seconds, the Open Plan Marketing Division dissolved into a hive of hushed, frantic whispers. The gala was the undisputed crown jewel of Seattle's corporate social calendar, a night where the tech elite, venture capitalists, and city politicians rubbed shoulders over beluga caviar. But this year, the email contained a detail that sent the office into an absolute frenzy. Richard Sterling, the chairman of the board, had officially confirmed that Arthur Pendelton, the elusive, reclusive 32-year-old billionaire founder, would be in attendance and delivering the keynote address. Isabella Rossi sat at her pristine glass desk, staring at her dual monitors. She read the final paragraph of the email 3 times, her heart hammering a fierce, staccato rhythm against her ribs. "He's coming," she thought, her green eyes widening with predatory focus. "He's actually going to be there. Did you see?" Chloe asked, rolling her ergonomic chair over to the edge of Isabella's cubicle. She looked mildly terrified by the intense, unblinking expression on Isabella's face. "The CEO is going to make an appearance. People are saying he hasn't been to a public event in almost 4 years." "I saw," Isabella breathed, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't look away from the screen. Her mind was already operating at light speed, calculating logistics, angles, and budgets. "This is it, Chloe. This is the moment. He's going to be in a room with a closed guest list. No heiresses flown in from Paris, no supermodels. Just the corporate roster and local VIPs. The odds have never been better." "Izzy, you can't be serious," Chloe sighed, rubbing her temples. "There will be 2,000 people there. He's going to be surrounded by a wall of security and senior executives. You're a junior marketing rep. How are you even going to get close to him? Isabella finally turned to her colleague, a sharp, brilliant, entirely ruthless smile spreading across her lips. By being the only thing in that entire cavernous ballroom worth looking at. I need to leave at lunch. Cover for me. If HR asks, tell them I'm at a site visit for the Q4 campaign. Without waiting for an answer, Isabella snatched her Prada handbag from the floor, grabbed her sleek trench coat, and marched toward the elevators. The countdown had begun, and she had exactly 9 days to transform herself from an ambitious employee into an unavoidable, devastating force of nature. The cost of ambition. An hour later, Isabella was standing on a plush velvet pedestal in the private fitting room of an ultra-exclusive boutique in downtown Seattle. The air smelled of expensive lilies and leather. It is, quite frankly, a masterpiece, Miss Rossi, the boutique owner purred, circling Isabella with a tape measure draped around her neck. Oscar de la Renta. Straight off the runway. You have the exact bone structure to carry this off without letting the dress wear you. Isabella turned sideways, staring at her reflection in the gilded floor-to-ceiling mirror. The dress was breathtaking. It was a deep, liquid crimson silk that seemed to glow from within. It featured a daring, plunging neckline, a completely backless design, and a slit that rode dangerously high up her left thigh. It hugged every curve with architectural precision. It didn't just scream wealth, it screamed power. It was the dress of a CEO's wife. It's perfect, Isabella whispered, running a hand down the smooth silk of the skirt. How much? The boutique owner didn't miss a beat. $8,500. Plus alterations. Isabella's stomach plummeted. Beneath her confident facade, a cold sweat broke out along her spine. Her checking account currently held exactly $1,420. She had already maxed out her primary American Express card on the deposit for her luxury apartment and a matching set of designer luggage. She stared at her reflection. She pictured herself walking down the grand staircase of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. She pictured the mysterious, unimaginably wealthy Arthur Pendelton turning his head, the world stopping as his eyes locked onto hers. What was $8,000 compared to billions? It wasn't an expense. It was an investment. I'll take it, Isabella said, her voice completely steady, betraying none of the financial terror clawing at her throat. She stepped back into the dressing room, pulled out her phone, and spent 10 agonizing minutes applying for a high-interest, instant approval retail credit card. When the screen flashed green with an approved limit of $10,000, she let out a shaky breath, closed her eyes, and walked out to the register to swipe her financial future away. The basement sanctuary. 70 floors below Isabella's shopping spree, the world operated on a vastly different frequency. Arthur Pendleton sat on a folding metal chair in the subterranean maintenance break room, surrounded by exposed pipes, the heavy hum of the building's HVAC system, and the sharp scent of industrial pine cleaner. He was wearing his blue jumpsuit, eating a bruised apple, and staring blankly at a bulletin board covered in union notices and shift schedules. The incident in the cafeteria 3 days ago was still playing on a loop in his mind. He had expected the people in his company to be dismissive of the janitorial staff. He had expected them to be invisible. He had not expected the sheer, gleeful malice that Isabella had weaponized against him. The way she had publicly humiliated him not for anything he had done, but simply for existing in a lower tax bracket had deeply shaken his faith in the corporate culture he had built. He had created a machine that rewarded ruthlessness, and Isabella was its perfect, terrifying byproduct. But every time the memory of Isabella's cruel laughter threatened to drag him into a cynical depression, another image surfaced to push it back. A cheap, white paper cup of drip coffee. 2 sugars. And the warm, intensely empathetic eyes of Maya. Arthur threw his apple core into the trash and stood up, grabbing his yellow cart. It was time for his afternoon sweep of the 30th floor. The legal department. When he pushed through the swinging doors of the 30th floor, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the manic energy of marketing. It was quiet, methodical, and smelled of stale printer toner. Arthur navigated his cart down the aisles, methodically emptying the small blue recycling bins under each desk. As he approached the administrative cluster near the filing room, he saw her. Maya was sitting at her desk, her brow furrowed in concentration as she typed rapidly on her keyboard, a pair of blue light reading glasses slipping down the bridge of her nose. She was wearing a faded yellow cardigan over a simple white blouse, and her curly dark hair was pulled up into a chaotic, messy bun secured by a single pencil. She looked exhausted, but incredibly beautiful in a way that required zero effort or calculation. Arthur parked his cart and gently tapped his knuckles against the edge of her cubicle. Maya jumped slightly, then looked up. The moment she saw him, the stress melted from her face, replaced by a brilliant, lighting up the room smile. She quickly pulled the pencil from her hair, letting the curls tumble down around her shoulders, and took off her glasses. "Artie." She beamed. "You're right on time. I was just about to fall asleep on my keyboard." "Afternoon, Maya," Arthur said, leaning casually against the partition. It amazed him how easily his shoulders dropped and his breathing slowed when he was around her. There were no defenses needed here. "Rough day." "Just endless depositions to file," she sighed, stretching her arms over her head. She reached under her desk and pulled out a battered thermos. "I brought reinforcements today. I made a fresh pot at home. French roast. Want a cup?" "Only if you have those 2 sugars," Arthur smiled warmly. Maya poured a steaming cup and handed it to him. Arthur took a sip. It was infinitely better than the $20,000 espresso machine in his penthouse. "So," Maya said, leaning forward on her elbows, her brown eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Did you see the email this morning? About the Diamond Gala?" Arthur's heart gave a slight, nervous kick. "I might have caught a glimpse of it on the break room corkboard. Sounds like quite the party." "It's the party of the decade, apparently," Maya laughed, shaking her head. "The whole building is losing its mind because the CEO is going to show up. The girls in paralegal have been whispering about him all day. They say he's some kind of mysterious, brooding genius." Arthur expertly suppressed a cough, taking another sip of his coffee. "Is that right? And what do you think of this, mysterious genius?" Maya shrugged, her expression turning surprisingly thoughtful. "I don't know. He's a billionaire, right? People with that kind of money, they exist in a different reality. I'm sure he's very smart to have built all of this," she gestured to the sprawling office around them, "but I can't imagine he knows what it's like for the rest of us. I bet he hasn't had to worry about a grocery bill in a very long time." Arthur looked down at his calloused, unmanicured hands. "You think wealth changes a person?" "I think it isolates them," Maya replied softly. She looked at Arthur with absolute sincerity. "I think when you have everything, people stop telling you the truth. They just tell you what you want to hear so they can get a piece of your pie. I wouldn't want to live like that. I'd rather have a friend who brings me a cheap coffee than 1,000 people who only pretend to like me." Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. It took every ounce of his willpower not to reach across the desk and take her hand. She had perfectly diagnosed the profound loneliness that had driven him to put on the blue jumpsuit in the first place. "Maya," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a bit rougher. "Pendelton Enterprises does a lottery every year for the support staff. For the gala, maintenance, administrative, security, they draw a few names so we can go. Just to, boost morale." Maya's eyes widened. "Really? I've only worked here for 6 months, I had no idea." "Yeah," Arthur lied smoothly, mentally making a note to actually institute this policy company-wide tomorrow. "Well, they drew the names this morning. And, uh, my name was pulled. I got 2 tickets. Artie. That's amazing. Maya clapped her hands together, genuinely thrilled for him. You get to go eat the fancy caviar and see how the other half lives. You have to take tons of pictures and tell me everything. Arthur took a deep breath. He gripped the edge of his yellow bucket so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was standing on the edge of a precipice. If he took her, he would have to reveal everything. The charade would end. But looking at her warm, beautiful face, he knew he couldn't imagine being in that ballroom without her. The tickets are for 2, Arthur said slowly, holding her gaze. And, well, I don't really know anyone else in the building besides the guys downstairs. And they aren't exactly the tuxedo type. So, I was wondering. He rubbed the back of his neck, playing the part of the nervous blue-collar worker flawlessly. Would you want to go with me? As my guest? Maya froze. The bustling noise of the 30th floor seemed to fade away. She looked at Arthur, her lips parted in surprise. You want to take me? I can't promise I'll be much fun, Arthur smiled, a self-deprecating glimmer in his eye. I don't know which fork to use for the salad, and I'll probably feel completely out of place. But, there's a free open bar, and the food is supposed to be incredible. And honestly, Maya, you're the only person in this building who treats me like a human being. I'd be honored if you came with me. A slow, radiant blush crept up Maya's neck and colored her cheeks. She looked down at her hands, a shy, incredibly sweet smile breaking across her face. I'd love to, Artie, she said softly, looking back up at him. I really would. Arthur felt a surge of triumph and terror wash over him simultaneously. The die was cast. The diverging paths. The next week was a study in absolute contrasts. On the 42nd floor, Isabella Rossi was living in a state of hyperventilating anxiety. She had visited the tailor 4 times in 5 days, screaming at a terrified seamstress over a millimeter of slack near the waistline of her crimson dress. She had booked a blowout at the most expensive salon in the city, purchased a new array of high-end cosmetics, and spent her evenings aggressively researching Arthur Pendelton's limited biographical data, trying to memorize his philanthropic interests and college majors so she could casually slip them into conversation. She was barely eating, living on iced lattes and raw ambition. Meanwhile, on the 30th floor, Maya was in a state of mild, happy panic. She didn't have $8,000. She barely had $80 of disposable income after sending money back to her mother in Portland. On Saturday afternoon, she and her roommate, Sarah, scoured 3 different vintage stores and a theatrical rental shop. It's just a work party, Maya kept insisting, pushing through racks of overly sequined gowns. I don't need to look like a movie star. I just need to not embarrass Artie. He's taking you to the Diamond Gala, Maya. You can't show up looking like you're going to a church picnic, Sarah argued, pulling out a hanger. Wait. Look at this. It was a lavender chiffon dress. It wasn't designer. It didn't have a plunging neckline or a thigh-high slit. It was simple, elegant, with a modest sweetheart neckline and a flowing skirt that looked like it was made of watercolor clouds. Maya tried it on in the cramped, dimly lit fitting room. When she stepped out, she looked soft, ethereal, and beautifully understated. It's perfect, Sarah whispered. The rental fee was $65. Maya paid it with a genuine, excited smile. On the eve of the gala, Arthur Pendleton stood in his sprawling, minimalist penthouse overlooking the Seattle skyline. The city was a sea of glittering lights below him. Laid out on his massive, king-sized bed were 2 entirely different lives. On the left side lay the stiff, faded navy blue polycotton jumpsuit. The name tag Artie caught the dim light of the bedroom. Next to it sat the scuffed, heavy-duty work boots that had carried him through the hidden veins of his own empire for the past month. On the right side lay a garment bag from Tom Ford. Unzipped, it revealed a bespoke, midnight blue tuxedo, a crisp white pique cotton shirt with diamond stud buttons, and a pair of perfectly polished black patent leather Oxfords. Arthur walked over and picked up the blue jumpsuit. He ran his thumb over the embroidered name tag. This uniform had given him the greatest gift of his life, the truth. It had shown him the ugly, mercenary heart of Isabella Rossi, and it had introduced him to the pure, uncalculated kindness of Maya. He set the jumpsuit down and turned to the tuxedo. Tomorrow night, the ghost would die, and the billionaire would be resurrected. He knew the shockwaves would be massive. He knew Isabella's reaction would be a spectacle. But as he looked at the perfectly tailored suit, the only thing he truly cared about was the look that would cross Maya's face when she realized the man who emptied her trash was the king of the castle. He just prayed she would ever forgive him for the lie. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel had been transformed into a kingdom of ice and light for Pendelton Enterprises' annual Diamond Gala. Thousands of teardrop crystals dripped from the vaulted ceilings, catching the light of 100 strategically placed spotlights and scattering prisms across the walls. A 12-piece string quartet played elegant, classical renditions of modern pop songs from a velvet-draped balcony. The air was thick with the intoxicating, expensive scents of Tom Ford cologne, Chanel perfume, and thousands of imported white orchids that cascaded from towering silver vases on every table. Waiters in white gloves glided silently through the sea of the city's elite, carrying silver trays adorned with flutes of Dom Perignon and Beluga caviar blinis. It was exactly the kind of environment Isabella Rossi felt she was born to conquer. She made her entrance at precisely 8:15 p.m., perfectly timed to ensure maximum visibility. When she stepped through the gilded mahogany doors, heads turned. She had starved herself for 3 days and maxed out her remaining 2 credit cards to afford the crimson, backless Oscar de la Renta gown that clung to her curves like a second skin. A daring slit rode up her left thigh, showcasing a new pair of stroppy diamond-encrusted heels. Her dark hair was swept up into an intricate, elegant chignon, exposing the delicate line of her neck and a borrowed emerald pendant that rested against her collarbone. She looked absolutely devastating, and she knew it. Isabella accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter without looking at him and immediately began scanning the room with the practiced, predatory grace of a hawk looking for a field mouse. She dismissed the mid-level managers and junior VPs with a single, sweeping glance. Tonight was not about networking, it was about hunting. She bypassed Trent, who was staring at her with his jaw practically resting on his bow tie, and smoothly navigated her way toward the velvet-roped VIP section near the main stage. That was where the elusive Arthur Pendelton would eventually materialize. Across the room, standing near a towering ice sculpture of the company's logo, Arthur stood with Maya. The transformation he had undergone was absolute. The stooped, shuffling posture of Artie the janitor was gone, replaced by the commanding, broad-shouldered stance of a man accustomed to having the world yield to him. He wore a bespoke, midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo with a black satin peak lapel that had been tailored to a fraction of a millimeter of his exact measurements. His unruly hair had been expertly styled, swept back with a subtle pomade, and his jawline was sharply defined, free of the rough stubble he had cultivated over the past month. He wore a platinum Patek Philippe watch on his left wrist, a silent testament to unimaginable wealth. Beside him, Maya looked beautiful, but entirely out of her element. She wore a lovely, understated lavender chiffon dress that she had rented from a boutique downtown. It was simple, elegant, and hopelessly outmatched by the haute couture surrounding them. She clutched a small silver clutch tightly in front of her, her eyes wide as she took in the sheer opulence of the room. "I can't believe they let us in here," Maya whispered, leaning close to Arthur. "Are you sure security didn't make a mistake? I mean, I know it's a company party, but this feels exclusive." Arthur smiled gently, looking down at her. Over the past few weeks, their cafeteria coffees had evolved into a genuine, deeply comforting friendship. Maya was exactly who she appeared to be, kind, fiercely intelligent, and completely grounded. "You have a company badge, don't you?" Arthur murmured, his deep voice smooth and reassuring. "You have every right to be here, Maya. And frankly, you're the most beautiful woman in the room." Maya blushed furiously, looking down at her rented heels. "You clean up remarkably well yourself, Artie. I didn't know you owned a tuxedo like this. It looks incredibly expensive." "It's a special occasion," Arthur replied smoothly, though a pang of guilt twisted in his chest. He had arranged for a private car to pick her up, claiming he had borrowed it from a friend. He had shielded her from his true identity because he needed to know if her friendship was real. Now that he knew it was, the impending revelation weighed heavily on him. He didn't want to scare her away. "Just promise me one thing," Arthur said, his tone suddenly turning serious. He reached out, gently touching her arm. Maya looked up, her warm brown eyes meeting his. "What is it?" "No matter what happens tonight, no matter what you hear, remember that the man who drank cheap coffee with you in the lobby is the real me. Everything else is just noise." Maya furrowed her brow, confused by the cryptic statement, but she nodded slowly. "Okay, Artie. I promise." The hunt. Isabella was growing impatient. She was holding court near the grand staircase, gracefully batting away the advances of a senior financial analyst. She nodded along to his boring anecdote about golf, her piercing green eyes constantly darting over his shoulder. Suddenly, she spotted her. Maya. The mousy little legal assistant who always wore practical shoes. Isabella's lip curled into a sneer. What is she doing here? Isabella thought, eyeing Maya's simple lavender dress with utter disdain. Did she get lost on the way to a high school prom? But then, Isabella's gaze shifted to the man standing next to Maya. His back was turned to Isabella, but even from 30 feet away, he radiated power. He was tall, his shoulders broad and powerful beneath the impossibly perfect cut of his midnight blue tuxedo. The way he stood, the relaxed but dominant posture, screamed old money and high status. Isabella felt a thrill of electricity shoot down her spine. That's him, she thought, her pulse quickening. That has to be him. A man like that doesn't just wander in off the street. She quickly excused herself from the boring financial analyst and began to weave through the crowd, her eyes locked onto the broad back of the mysterious man in the midnight blue tuxedo. She mentally rehearsed her opening line. It had to be witty, charming, and slightly aloof. She would pretend she didn't know he was the CEO, creating an illusion of organic, faded connection. She was 10 feet away when the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The crystal chandeliers dimmed, casting the vast ballroom into a sudden, dramatic twilight. A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd of 2,000 people. A single, blindingly bright spotlight snapped on, illuminating the center of the grand stage at the front of the room. Isabella stopped in her tracks, her heart hammering against her ribs. She positioned herself at the very edge of the velvet rope, ensuring she had a clear, unobstructed view of the stage, and more importantly, that whoever walked up there would have a clear view of her in her crimson Oscar de la Renta. An older gentleman with silver hair and a distinguished posture walked up to the sleek acrylic podium. It was Richard Sterling, the chairman of the board. He tapped the microphone, the sharp thump-thump echoing over the high-fidelity sound system. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Sterling's booming voice filled the silent room. "Welcome to the 10th Annual Diamond Gala. Tonight, we celebrate a decade of unprecedented innovation, global expansion, and the relentless pursuit of excellence." The crowd erupted into polite, manicured applause. Isabella clapped enthusiastically, a brilliant, practiced smile plastered on her face. 10 years ago, Sterling continued, his voice echoing with reverence, this company was nothing more than a brilliant algorithm and a daring vision conceived in a cramped apartment. Today, Pendelton Enterprises moves the world. And none of it would be possible without the singular genius, the unwavering dedication, and the formidable leadership of our founder. Isabella held her breath. Her manicured nails dug into the soft leather of her clutch. This was it. He rarely makes public appearances, preferring to let the company's success speak for itself, Sterling said, a fond smile touching his lips. But tonight, we are honored to have him step out from behind the curtain. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our visionary, our CEO, Mr. Arthur Pendelton. The room exploded into thunderous applause. The spotlight violently jerked away from the stage, slicing through the darkness of the ballroom like a scythe, sweeping over the heads of the elite crowd as it searched for the man of the hour. Isabella stood on her tiptoes, her eyes wide, desperately following the beam of light, ready to lock eyes with her future. The brilliant white beam swept past the VIP tables, past the ice sculptures, and finally slammed to a halt near the back of the room. It illuminated a tall man in a midnight blue tuxedo, standing next to a petite woman in a lavender dress. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. It was the man she had been walking toward. The man whose back had radiated such intense power and wealth. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, falling over themselves to clear a path. The applause swelled to a deafening roar. Slowly, the man turned around to face the stage. He stepped directly into the center of the blinding spotlight. Isabella's perfectly constructed world stopped spinning. The polite, brilliant smile froze on her face, slowly fracturing like thin ice under heavy boots. The air was violently sucked out of her lungs. A cold, nauseating wave of absolute horror crashed over her, starting at the crown of her head and plunging straight down into her designer heels. It was the jawline. The messy, slightly wavy dark hair that was now slicked back. The piercing, analytical eyes. No, Isabella's mind screamed in a loop of panicked denial. No. Impossible. No. 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 It was the janitor. It was Artie. The man she had screamed at for spilling water near her desk. The man whose cheap blue uniform she had loudly and viciously mocked in the middle of a crowded cafeteria. The man she had publicly humiliated, degraded, and dismissed as a pathetic, coupon-clipping peasant who wasn't worthy of breathing the same air as her. He wasn't a ghost employee. He wasn't the hired help. He was Arthur Pendelton. Isabella felt the blood drain entirely from her face, leaving her pale and clammy. Her knees suddenly felt like they were made of water. She reached out, her trembling hand gripping the brass stanchion of the velvet rope just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The roaring applause of the crowd sounded like it was coming from underwater. A loud, high-pitched ringing filled her ears. Arthur began to walk toward the stage. He moved with the predatory, effortless grace of a king surveying his court. He didn't look hunched. He didn't look meek. He exuded an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. As he walked down the cleared aisle, billionaires, senators, and elite executives practically bowed in reverence, clapping furiously. And then, as he passed the velvet rope, Arthur turned his head. Out of 2,000 people in the ballroom, his piercing eyes locked directly onto Isabella Rossi. For 3 agonizing, infinitely long seconds, the CEO of Pendelton Enterprises stared at the junior marketing executive. His face was a mask of cold, handsome indifference, but his eyes were alive with a terrifying, absolute knowing. He didn't sneer. He didn't glare. He simply looked at her, letting her drown in the realization of her own catastrophic arrogance. He saw her panic. He saw her horror. And he let her feel every agonizing second of it. Then, he smoothly broke eye contact and continued his ascent up the grand staircase to the stage. Isabella couldn't breathe. Her heart was beating so fast it physically hurt her ribs. The crimson Oscar de la Renta gown suddenly felt like a straitjacket. She had spent 5 years meticulously planning her ascension into high society, ruthlessly cutting down anyone she deemed beneath her, all to capture the ultimate prize. And she had just realized she had taken that prize, spat on it, and thrown it in the garbage. On stage, Arthur stepped up to the acrylic podium. The microphone picked up the rustle of his tuxedo. The entire ballroom fell into a dead, reverent silence. "Thank you, Richard," Arthur's deep, resonant baritone echoed through the cavernous room. It was the exact same voice that had politely asked her out for coffee in the Apex. Hearing it now, amplified and commanding, sent a fresh wave of nausea through Isabella's stomach. "When I look out at this room," Arthur began, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, "I see the architects of our success. But true success isn't just about what happens in the boardrooms or at the executive tables." His gaze deliberately drifted back toward the left side of the room, finding the terrified, pale face of the woman in the red dress. "Over the past month," Arthur continued, his voice dropping into a cooler, sharper register, "I decided to take a closer look at our company. Not from the penthouse, but from the ground floor. I wanted to see the character of the people who work here when they think the CEO isn't watching." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. "I learned that true value isn't measured by a job title, a designer suit, or the price tag on a pair of shoes," Arthur said, his words cutting through the air like a scalpel, aimed directly at Isabella's heart. "It is measured by character. By kindness. And by how we treat those we believe can do nothing for us." Isabella squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear of pure, unadulterated humiliation escaping and rolling down her perfectly contoured cheek. She was trapped. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. She could only stand there in her unpaid-for dress and wait for the executioner's axe to fall. The deafening roar of a standing ovation washed over the grand ballroom. 2,000 of Seattle's wealthiest and most influential elite were on their feet, their applause echoing off the crystal chandeliers. On stage, Arthur Pendelton offered a brief, polite nod. He didn't smile. He simply adjusted his cuffs, turned, and began his descent down the grand staircase. At the edge of the velvet rope, Isabella Rossi was struggling to breathe. Her mind was a chaotic storm of panic, denial, and sheer terror. The man she had verbally eviscerated in the cafeteria, the man she had treated like dirt on her shoe, was the very billionaire she had staked her entire future on marrying. The sheer magnitude of her miscalculation was physically nauseating. Her hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped her silver clutch. But as Arthur reached the bottom of the stairs and was immediately swarmed by a phalanx of sycophantic vice presidents and desperate investors, Isabella's survival instinct violently kicked in. "Think, Isabella, think," she commanded herself, her manicured fingernails digging painfully into her palms. "He's a man. And men are predictable. He didn't fire you on the spot. He didn't name you in his speech. He was testing the company, and yes, you failed the first test, but maybe this is the second test." Delusion, fueled by desperation, began to rewrite her reality. She convinced herself that her fierce, uncompromising attitude might actually be a twisted selling point to a ruthless CEO. Perhaps he respected a woman who knew what she wanted. If she could just get him alone, if she could turn on the charm that had never failed her before, she could spin this. She could apologize, play the victim of corporate stress, and laugh off the arty persona as a brilliant, eccentric test of her boundaries. Isabella smoothed down the front of her unpaid-for, crimson Oscar de la Renta gown. She forced the color back into her cheeks, plastered on her most devastating, apologetic smile, and plunged into the crowd. The interception. Arthur moved through the sea of billionaires with practiced, effortless grace. He shook hands, accepted congratulations, and expertly deflected requests for private meetings, his eyes constantly scanning the room. He was looking for the lavender dress. He finally spotted Maya standing near a towering champagne fountain. She looked utterly shell-shocked. Her eyes were wide, and she was staring at him as if he were a ghost. Arthur felt a sharp pang of anxiety. This was the moment he had dreaded. He began to move toward her, eager to explain, eager to prove that Artie wasn't a lie, he was the truest version of himself. Mr. Pendelton. Arthur, wait. A hand, adorned with a glittering Cartier love bracelet, clamped onto his forearm. Arthur stopped. He didn't flinch, but the air temperature around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. He slowly turned his head, looking down at the hand on his sleeve, and then up into the desperate, beautiful face of Isabella Rossi. The crowd immediately surrounding them sensed the shift in the atmosphere and instinctively took a half step back, creating a small, highly pressurized bubble of privacy in the middle of the ballroom. "Isabella," Arthur said. His voice was perfectly level, devoid of any anger, but entirely stripped of the mild-mannered warmth he had used as the janitor. It was the voice of a CEO addressing a rounding error on a spreadsheet. Isabella swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Up close, without the blue jumpsuit and the scuffed boots, Arthur was devastatingly intimidating. The bespoke midnight blue tuxedo seemed to absorb the light around him. "Arthur. I don't even know what to say," Isabella breathed, pitching her voice into a soft, sultry register. She looked up at him through her thick lashes, her emerald eyes shimmering with manufactured, apologetic tears. "I am so incredibly embarrassed. If I had known. If you had known I was the CEO, you would have treated me differently," Arthur finished for her, his tone analytical. "Yes. That was precisely the point of the exercise." No, that's not what I mean," Isabella quickly countered, her smile turning breathless and frantic. She stepped closer, invading his personal space, bathing him in the scent of her expensive perfume. "Arthur, you caught me on the worst days of my entire career. It's the end of Q3, the pressure from my department head has been crushing, and I was running on zero sleep. I was taking my stress out on the world, and you were just there. It was unforgivable, but it wasn't me." She let out a soft, self-deprecating laugh, reaching out to lightly touch the lapel of his tuxedo. "Honestly, I think I was just flustered. You have to admit, it's not every day a ridiculously handsome man in a uniform asks you out in the middle of the cafeteria. I panicked. I put up a wall. But I'd love to take you up on that coffee now. Or perhaps a drink. Somewhere quiet, so I can properly apologize." Arthur looked at the hand resting on his lapel. Then, he looked back up at her face. For a terrifying moment, he said absolutely nothing. He just studied her. He watched the desperate calculation behind her beautiful eyes. He saw the sheer, unadulterated greed that she couldn't quite manage to hide behind her fake apology. "A drink," Arthur finally repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Yes," Isabella nodded eagerly, sensing a crack in the ice. "Just the two of us." "The execution." Arthur reached up and gently, but with absolute finality, removed Isabella's hand from his jacket. "Isabella," Arthur began, his voice low enough that only she could hear, but possessing a density that made her bones vibrate. "You are a junior marketing executive. Your job is to spin narratives. To sell a version of reality that benefits you. But do not make the mistake of trying to market your personality to me." Isabella's breathless smile froze. The blood began to drain from her face once more. "You weren't stressed. You weren't flustered," Arthur continued, his piercing eyes locking her in place. "You were honest. When you looked at a man pushing a yellow bucket, you didn't see a human being having a hard day. You saw an insect. You saw someone you could degrade to make yourself feel taller." "Arthur, please, I was just..." "You made a spectacle of a man simply because he didn't fit into your 5-year plan," Arthur interrupted smoothly, cutting off her oxygen. "You mocked his clothes. You mocked his salary. You threatened to have HR throw him out on the street because a drop of water came near your Manolo Blahniks." Isabella took a shaky step backward. Her facade was crumbling, replaced by raw, unvarnished panic. I didn't mean those things. It was just a joke, it was. I only date men who own the building, Arthur quoted, his voice echoing with the exact same haughty, vicious cadence she had used in the cafeteria. Not the pathetic ones who mop its floors. Isabella let out a small, strangled gasp. She looked around wildly, realizing that the nearby executives, her bosses, her peers, were watching the exchange with morbid fascination. Her social execution was happening live, in the middle of the Diamond Gala. "Well, Isabella," Arthur said, taking a deliberate step toward her. "I own the building. I own the floor you stand on. I own the desk you sit at. And I can tell you, with absolute certainty, that I would rather spend the rest of my life drinking cheap drip coffee in a windowless basement break room than spend 5 minutes pretending to tolerate a woman whose heart is as bankrupt as yours." Tears, real, stinging tears of absolute humiliation, welled up in Isabella's eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, to defend herself, but no words came out. She had been thoroughly, surgically dismantled. "You don't need to worry about your job," Arthur added coldly, delivering the final, crushing blow. "I don't fire people for having terrible personalities. I'd have an empty building if I did. But understand this, in my company, and in my life, you are entirely, permanently invisible. Have a good evening, Miss Rossi." Arthur didn't wait for a response. He simply turned his back on her, dismissing her from his reality as easily as one discards a piece of junk mail. The true prize. Arthur walked away from the epicenter of Isabella's ruined ambitions and approached the champagne fountain. The crowd naturally parted for him, leaving a clear path to the petite woman in the rented lavender dress. Maya was clutching her silver purse so tightly her knuckles were white. As Arthur approached, she took a hesitant step backward, suddenly hyper-aware of the thousands of dollars of tailoring he was wearing and the billions of dollars attached to his name. "Artie," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Or Mr. Pendelton." Arthur stopped 2 feet away from her. The cold, terrifying CEO vanished instantly, melting away to reveal the warm, slightly tired man she had befriended in the lobby. He offered her a soft, genuine smile. "Just Artie," he said gently. "I'm sorry I lied to you, Maya. I truly am. But if I had introduced myself as Arthur Pendelton, would you have ever brought me that cup of coffee with 2 sugars? Maya stared at him. She looked past the bespoke tuxedo, past the sudden terrifying wealth, and looked at his eyes. They were the same eyes that had crinkled with quiet gratitude when she handed him that paper cup. They were the same eyes that had listened to her complain about the broken copier on the 30th floor. Slowly, the tension drained from her shoulders. A small, tentative smile broke through her shock. "Probably not," Maya admitted, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "I would have assumed you had an assistant for that." Arthur let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The relief was overwhelming. "I do. But yours tasted much better." He held out his hand, palm up. "The string quartet is playing an awfully good song. Would you do me the honor of a dance?" Maya looked down at his hand, then back up at his face. She placed her hand in his. "I warn you," she murmured, stepping closer to him. "I'm wearing rented heels, and I'm a terrible dancer." "That's perfectly fine," Arthur smiled, leading her toward the center of the ballroom floor. "I happen to be very good at cleaning up messes." Across the room, standing completely alone at the edge of the VIP section, Isabella Rossi watched the billionaire sweep the administrative assistant into a graceful waltz. No one was looking at Isabella anymore. The sycophants had moved on. The executives were pretending she didn't exist. She stood frozen in her crimson Oscar de la Renta gown, feeling the crushing weight of the 2 maxed-out credit cards it had cost her. She had spent her entire life chasing the glittering illusion of wealth, completely blind to the fact that the only thing of true value had been standing right in front of her, holding a mop. And she had thrown it all away.